been talking about the RRI Tools project, which is a project about developing tools for implementing responsible research and innovation as a sort of systemic approach across Europe. But what's really struck me is that we've been here at Acacia and all the children running around, which has been fantastic. As a parent myself, I really sympathise with that, and it reminds me that responsible innovation recognises the fact that innovation is about transforming futures. It's about their futures. The future of those children that are running around this institution at the moment, this museum at the moment, are living in, their future is going to be our present projected forward. We're creating their futures, and science and innovation is part of that. So the first thing to say about responsible innovation is that it recognises the transformative power of science and innovation to create futures. And it encourages us to think, what kind of future do we want science and innovation to create? The second thing responsible research and innovation recognises is that innovation is socially, politically, ethically entangled. It's not an apolitical thing. And so it tries to come to grips with the broader ethical, social, environmental, political dimensions of science and technology and innovation as they are happening, not at some point in the future. And the third thing to think about is that responsible research and innovation recognises that there's a lot of uncertainty. You cannot predict the outcomes and impacts of innovation easily in advance, and nor can you draw lines of accountability between the impacts of innovation and where they started at very easily too. So it has to answer the question, how do we proceed under conditions of uncertainty, ignorance and ambiguity? But fundamentally it asks us, what kind of future do we want science and innovation to produce, and how can we do so in an inclusive way? So that's the sort of rationale, I suppose. What RRI Tools is trying to do is develop a set of tools to try to help do that. And what we've been talking about is an organising conceptual framework within which that sits. And there are perhaps three levels to that. The first is that tools on their own are useful, but they're even better if they're placed within a broader context. If you want a hammer is useful, but it's only useful if you know what you're using it to build. So the project has drawn on four dimensions of responsible research and innovation, which say, in order to be responsible, research and innovation needs to be, first of all, inclusive. So it has to include voices in both the goals and the trajectories of the innovation process. And it needs to recognise diversity. It needs to recognise that 50% of the world's population are women, for example, so it has to be gender equal. And they have to have an equal voice. That's the first thing. The second thing is it needs to be anticipatory and reflexive. So it needs to ask, what kind of futures could science and innovation bring into the world, and what other kinds of futures could they bring that we're not thinking about? And it has to reflect on their purposes, their pathways, and so on and so forth. The third one is the need for openness and transparency. That's critically important, but very difficult, particularly in the private sector. But a commitment, for example, to open access of results, a commitment to transparency, and a commitment to research integrity is important, and largely there are lots of things happening on that front. All of those are useful, but only truly transformative if we are responsive, which is the sort of fourth process. Responsive as individuals, as scientists or as innovators, responsive at a systemic level, responsive as institutions. So those are the sort of process ideas, but I think what we've been talking about here over the last day or two is that those in themselves need to be situated in something bigger. And first of all, we've talked a little bit of what's described as meta-governance. What are the kinds of governance conditions that would allow RRI to be embedded, for example, at a European scale? And there are projects such as Resagora which are really helping to define some of those conditions under which RRI happens and will happen well. And finally, the last thing is you can do all of those processes but they only make sense if they have what we call a normative underpinning, if you're doing the right thing. And so that's a question about really the normative orientation of responsible research and innovation, as much as they relate to, for example, grand challenges. What's the right kind of innovation we want? Now, some people have described those in terms of the right impacts of science and innovation. Some of those have said we should relate those, some people have said we should relate those to those in the European Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty. Whatever it is, there has to be some sort of normative underpinning to responsible innovation as a process, and that is about our values as a society. What kind of values do we want to underpin research and innovation as a process that creates futures? And fundamentally, those are things like a commitment to sustainability, a commitment to privacy, a commitment to being ethical, and so on and so forth. And the key thing is that, finally, just to say that that normative orientation, that right thing to do, we cannot make assumptions of across the world. So what we think of as being the right thing to do in Europe, our own normative underpinning, may not be the same thing in another part of the world. And we've got to be very careful about imposing our own values, our own European sense of identity and values across the world, where they're also doing lots of wonderful pieces of science and innovation. So that sort of second order reflexivity, that bigger picture, that normative underpinning for science and innovation is critically important for responsible innovation. It needs to be something that the process informs, but is not something that we can assume is the right thing to do simply from a European perspective.